Few of Oregon's natural resources are as closely tied to its people as the Willamette River. Flowing through major cities and farmland alike, it's a popular local choice for boating and fishing. Likewise, a handful of public parks are scattered along its banks, offering the occasional hiking trail or campground. But half a century ago, this was all part of a much grander vision. A singular connected park along the entire river, over 200 miles in length. It may sound like a pipe dream, but a surprising amount of effort was put into making this ideal reality. And its story leaves us with some difficult questions that may never be fully answered. For thousands of years, the Willamette River was home to the region's native peoples, such as the Kalapuya, Chinook, and Clackamas. To them, the river was something to be respected, a force to be reckoned with. This would change drastically in the mid-19th century, when the Oregon Trail ushered hundreds of thousands of new settlers into the Willamette Valley. Within a few generations, these fertile lands were transformed into an agricultural powerhouse. Nearby forests fueled a booming timber and paper industry. Small settlements grew into bustling cities. The river was soon being pumped full of pesticides, industrial pollutants, and human waste. Oxygen levels in the water were so low that salmon and other native fish suffocated to death. Boards of health banned people from swimming in the toxic waters. In 1938, voters approved the first law controlling pollution of the river. While this was years ahead of its time, the law wasn't strongly enforced, and the situation only got worse as the population continued to grow. It wasn't until 1961 that the Oregon State Legislature finally introduced a new pollution bill. Among its biggest proponents was Senator Robert Straub. As a lifelong outdoorsman himself, he was well aware of the river's problems, and felt it was finally time for Oregonians to take some accountability. Thanks to his tireless efforts, the bill passed, and the river had its first new pollution control in over 20 years. Water treatment didn't exactly grab the general public's attention, but this would change in the following year. In 1962, news station KGW aired a documentary called Pollution in Paradise. For the first time, the disgusting state of the Willamette River was on full display in Oregonians' living rooms. This was the pet project of local newscaster Tom McCall, who had taken a strong interest in environmental issues over the last few years. McCall left no stone unturned in his investigation. He aptly described the river as an open sewer, showing how its pollution was impacting the local quality of life. If something wasn't done about it soon, the damage would be irreversible. Practically overnight, the documentary spawned a renewed public interest in local pollution issues. And with McCall's popularity quickly growing, he began shifting toward a career in politics. 2 years later, in 1964, Bob Straub was elected as state treasurer, while Tom McCall earned his first public office as Secretary of State. While Straub was a Democrat and McCall a Republican, they quickly became close friends.
We had the same basic value system, and I respected Tom and enjoyed his company so much. Now, I can't say anything but very complimentary things about Tom.
As the two worked under Governor Mark Hatfield, they urged for further protection of Oregon's environment. But Hatfield had little interest in this type of policy, leaving Straub and McCall to campaign for the issues themselves. As historian Charles Johnson writes, Straub organized a press event in Portland on the Willamette River at one of the sewer outfalls, demonstrating for the assembled reporters that the contamination was intense. As if to prove his point, as Straub lifted a large fish carcass from the riverbank, its flesh slid off into the river, leaving the startled state treasurer holding the head in its bones. Despite these efforts for public awareness, the river continued to flow with filth. But things would finally come to a head in the summer of 1965. Historian Brent Walth writes, "As the summer approached, the river shrank, the pulp mills fired up, and dumped their loads into the river. Without adequate reservoirs to flush itself clean, the Willamette clogged with waste. The 1966 race for the governorship became a referendum on the river in the state's environmental future. And the timing couldn't be better. Straub and McCall were soon chosen as the Democrat and Republican candidates respectively. No matter which of them was elected, Oregon would soon usher in a new era of environmental reform. In the months leading up to the 1966 election, Bob Straub knew he was fighting an uphill battle. While he'd been involved in Oregon politics for over a decade, he was largely unknown by the general public. In contrast, Tom McCall's years as a local radio and TV reporter had already won him the hearts of many Oregonians. As the two men embarked on the campaign trail, both of them were sent a letter from Dr. Carl Onthank at the University of Oregon. Onthank was a respected conservationist in his own right, and had spent decades leading conservation projects across the state. Seeing the rapid population growth in the valley, he feared that the riverbanks would soon be completely overrun by urban sprawl. He urged the state government to preserve the river as soon as possible, and to explore its untapped potential for recreation. As he wrote in his letter, "A Willamette River Parkway the whole length of the main stem of the river should be made a major goal in planning for the river. Public agencies should be encouraged to acquire land along the banks of the river not already in public ownership, with deeper acquisitions for riverside parks at appropriate sites." Onthank hoped that either Straub or McCall would latch onto this ambitious idea, to transform the heavily polluted river into one of the finest conservation projects in the nation. Tom McCall pondered the letter, and prepared to announce his own version of the idea on the campaign trail. But as it just so happened, Bob Straub beat him to the punch by mere hours. On the morning of July 19th, Straub announced his vision for what he called Willamette River Rediscovered. This expanded on many of Onthank's ideas and brought them into public awareness for the first time.
It's something that you have to feel yourself. It has to be something that you genuinely feel something about. Like I felt something about the miserable condition of the Willamette River. Did I sense there'd be a big public level of support? No, I didn't know it. But when I began talking about it, it became very obvious very soon that, my God, if people really care about these things, there's a lot of public support for these things.
The way Straub saw it, residents of the Willamette Valley already had two major corridors for recreation: the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Cascade Mountains to the east. A continuous riverfront park, with trails spanning from Portland to Eugene, would be a third recreational corridor right in their backyard. The Eugene Register Guard wrote, "One thing about State Treasurer Robert W. Straub, he's got imagination. His newest idea is more than just commendable, it's great. And it shows that he's thinking about Oregon not so much as it is today, as the way it's going to be 20 and more years hence." The Oregonian was a bit more skeptical, writing, "While outdoor lovers in the metropolitan areas may hail this proposal to open the waterway to greater public use, the owners of riverside dwellings and farms may not be so enchanted. The Willamette Corridor may well be an attainable objective. But he should expect a lot of bricks with the bouquets to liven his gubernatorial campaign against Tom McCall." While McCall had narrowly missed his chance to introduce the parkway himself, he publicly praised Straub for the idea. And in fact, he began promoting it heavily in his own campaign as well. Their political debates were soon nicknamed the Tom and Bob Show, as it was almost comical how much the two candidates agreed on. However, this was actually hurting Straub's campaign. Announcing the parkway had finally helped him stand out to voters. But with his popular rival now supporting the same idea, Straub found it difficult to set himself apart. On November 8, 1966, voters selected McCall as their next governor. While the defeat was disappointing for Straub, there was some comfort in knowing that many of his ideas would still be championed. and the Willamette River itself would soon become the focus of one of the most ambitious projects in the state's history. When Tom McCall gave his inaugural speech in January of 1967, he vowed that the Willamette Recreational Greenway, as it was now called, would be one of his very first priorities.
A few weeks ago, I said the overriding challenge, the umbrella issue of the campaign and of the decade in Oregon is quality of life in Oregon. I respectfully suggest to you that the proposals this administration has submitted to you today will meet that challenge and will further dramatize the significance of that issue.
McCall assigned the Greenway project to the Oregon Highway Commission, led by Glenn Jackson. Much of the day-to-day work would be handled by Oregon Parks and Recreation, led by David Talbot. At the time, the Parks Department was a branch of the Highway Commission, so they essentially operated as a single unit. Right away, they appointed a 6-member task force to study the feasibility of the Greenway concept. The resulting report confirmed that, yes, it was indeed feasible, as long as some of the more ambitious aspects were dialed down. For example, the task force agreed that the Greenway should have extensive trails, campsites, and river access. But great swaths of the riverbanks were in low-lying floodplains, which were impractical for developing a park. For this reason, they recommended that recreational areas should only be developed where it made sense to do so. The bigger challenge was the fact that nearly all of the land along the river was privately owned. Bob Straub had wanted the state to bring all of these properties into public ownership. But the task force recommended that private homes and farms should generally be left alone, with trails being developed around them wherever possible. With this alternate vision now being proposed, conflict arose immediately. Some people felt that the task force plan was too watered down and not ambitious enough. Others felt that Straub's plan for a continuous park was unrealistic and financially impractical. Ultimately, Governor McCall sided with the task force, and within a couple weeks, a Greenway bill was drafted for the state legislature. Meanwhile, the Greenway was becoming a hot-button issue with local farmers. While many of them supported the river's conservation, they didn't like the idea of the general public stomping across their property. As Howard Fuji with the Oregon Farm Bureau put it, "What will this do to the farmers along the river? If trails are built across pastures, who will pay for fences, gates, or cattle guards? Who will pay for fruit and vegetables when picnickers help themselves to the fruits of the land? Who will clean up after litterbugs?" But the biggest concern was how private land would be acquired for the Greenway. Those who preferred a strong governmental approach, like Bob Straub, urged the state to condemn private land if the owners weren't willing to sell. The Highway Commission had actually been using this method for years. At the time, they were condemning hundreds of urban properties to clear the way for Oregon's new freeway system. Farmers knew that if the Greenway was handled in a similar way, it was only a matter of time before the government would take their land as well. Eventually, the bill was reworked in their favor. The state would only be allowed to acquire Greenway land from willing sellers. Condemnation would be completely off the table. Governor McCall signed the bill into law on June 30th, 1967. Known as the Willamette River Park System Act, this officially established the Greenway program for the first time. While this was a big step forward, Straub and his supporters criticized McCall for not pursuing the more ambitious plan. But McCall was no slouch when it came to preserving the state's natural beauty. While the Greenway debate was waging in the valley, a similar fight was heating up on the Pacific coast. Back in 1913, the Oregon legislature had passed a law protecting the state's beaches for public use. But now, a half-century later, it was clear that the guidelines for public versus private use were not well defined. McCall supported a new bill that would clear up these issues, and this quickly gained widespread support. 1 week after signing the Greenway Act into law, McCall signed the Oregon Beach Bill, officially preserving the state's 300 miles of coastline for public use.
This bill guarantees that Oregon's coastline will remain secure for generations to come. And in so doing, it will enable Oregon to meet its burgeoning needs for recreation far into the future.
With this kind of legislation becoming more common, Oregon was quickly growing into a national leader on environmental policy. And the Greenway itself, despite its conflicting views, was shaping up to become a major part of this new cultural identity. With the Greenway Act now signed, work was soon underway to define its general boundaries. On the south end, the Greenway would start in the river's two main forks, about 16 miles of the middle fork as far as Dexter Dam, and about 29 miles of the coast fork as far as Cottage Grove Dam. From this point onward, the Greenway would follow the entire main stem of the Willamette River itself. This would run for 187 miles up to Portland, where it reached its confluence with the Columbia River. The Greenway would continue a little farther north, running another 21 miles along the Multnomah Channel. All told, the Greenway would span more than 250 river miles, covering about 25,000 acres. Management of the project would be split up among the 9 counties and 20 cities along the river. Since these local governments couldn't afford the land acquisitions on their own, the cost would be split 3 ways. 25% would be paid at the local level, another 25% would be matched at the state level, and the remaining 50% would be matched at the federal level. This was helpful in theory, but in practice, the project was underfunded on all 3 levels. As the Oregonian wrote, "Most local governments along the river are hard up for cash. And the Greenway system, despite its obvious long-range recreational attractions, occupies a low priority on governmental lists of things we need now. Few counties have bothered to apply for matching funds when they are beset on all sides by residential demands for more practical services such as sewers, mass transit, flood, and pollution controls." For these reasons, progress was extremely slow over the next few years. Bob Straub could only watch from the sidelines, aggrieved that this program was nothing like his original vision. By the time the 1970 election season arrived, Straub was more motivated than ever to win the governor's race. At a fundraising dinner in Eugene, he said, "After 4 years of McCall, the state has acquired 3 miles. At that rate, it will take somewhere between 600 and 800 years to complete the project." As Charles Johnson writes, State Treasurer Straub continued in the role of the aggressive insurgent, a provocateur pushing Governor McCall forward on a gathering host of environmental issues. But these 2 political leaders, who genuinely liked one another, managed to avoid the nasty, name-calling tit-for-tat political spiral that was tearing the rest of the nation apart. Unlike the last election, Straub was enjoying greater recognition with voters, and the polls were consistently coming back in his favor. Meanwhile, McCall was dealing with increasingly violent Vietnam War protests in Portland. The FBI warned him that thousands of anti-war radicals were planning to disrupt a convention of the American Legion, an event that President Nixon was slated to attend. To avoid a violent crisis, it was suggested to McCall that the state should sponsor a music festival similar to Woodstock. This would keep the activists distracted and far away from Portland during the convention. McCall found the idea ludicrous. But, as Brent Walth writes, no matter the result, whether he allowed violence to erupt in Portland, or if he pandered to hippies, McCall could expect to lose re-election. He spun his chair around to face his aides. "I've made my decision," McCall told them, "and I've just committed political suicide." And thus, the state of Oregon hosted Vortex 1, a week-long festival filled with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. While this decision was panned by critics at first, the crazy idea actually worked. The American Legion convention went smoothly, and the streets of Portland remained peaceful. Of course, Nixon never actually showed up, and it was later revealed that the FBI had greatly exaggerated the threat. But as far as voters were concerned, McCall was willing to sacrifice his political career for their safety, and to throw a wild party to boot. With this major turnaround just weeks before the election, Straub's campaign was effectively over. On November 3rd, McCall was elected to his second term as governor, cementing his legacy as one of the most popular figures in Oregon history. Bob Straub would once again have to wait 4 years before he'd have another chance. And in the meantime, the Willamette Greenway would only grow further from his original dream. By the time Governor McCall started his second term in 1971, very little progress had been made on the Greenway. Most landowners had no interest in selling their property, and local governments didn't have the resources to pursue it more vigorously. Likewise, the program's federal funding was going to expire if the state didn't move forward more quickly. Recognizing these issues, Glenn Jackson brainstormed a solution. The Highway Commission couldn't legally condemn private land under the Greenway program, but they could condemn land if it was technically for state parks. Using this simple loophole, they could speed up progress on the Greenway, while taking some of the burden off the local governments. At the time, 2 state parks were already established along the river. Champoeg State Park had existed since the 1920s, and comprised about 500 acres near Butteville. Mary S. Young State Park was much newer, comprising 130 acres near West Lynn. To expand on this, Glenn Jackson asked Dave Talbot to identify a future state park in each of the 9 counties along the river. In the end, only 5 counties had land that was suitable. Clackamas County would get Molalla Pudding River State Park, comprising 450 acres north of Canby. Marion County would get Lone Tree Bar State Park, comprising over 1,400 acres north of Salem. On the border of Lynn and Benton counties would be Lower Kyger Island State Park, comprising 1,000 acres west of Albany. Also bordering Lynn and Benton counties would be Norwood Island State Park, comprising 900 acres south of Corvallis. Lane County would get Dexter Dam State Park, comprising 700 acres north of Dexter. In the spring of 1971, Oregon Parks and Recreation announced their plans to develop these 5 parks. Privately, their plan was to purchase the land from willing sellers as much as possible, but they would resort to condemnation if necessary. Meanwhile, by 1972, conservation efforts had reduced the Willamette River's pollution by 90%. The water was finally deemed safe again for swimming, and salmon were migrating in much healthier numbers. The river was a national success story, even getting coverage by National Geographic. As the article states, "To Oregon, the future is worth planning today." The Greenway program, which may not reach fruition for many years, typifies the state's far-sighted attitude. By passing progressive anti-pollution legislation, Oregon has produced a highly imaginative, innovative cleanup program that could well serve as a pattern for other states. But by this point, the Highway Commission was hitting a wall with the State Parks project. About 2/3 of landowners were not willing to sell. If the new parks were going to be completed, the department would have to start taking the land by force. Even though they were in their legal rights to do this, many officials felt uneasy about this approach. Historian Webb Bauer writes, "The question of ethics, was it just and proper, was a separate matter. Here, opinion was far more divided. Most state officials were aware that the program violated the intent, if not the letter, of the 1967 Greenway Act. No single event in the Greenway program had such far-reaching consequences as this decision to circumvent the 1967 law. In the summer of 1972, the state began moving forward with condemnation proceedings on private lots. Practically overnight, the news spread like wildfire through the valley. Landowners had been told for years that they wouldn't be forced to give up their property for the Greenway. Now, suddenly, their worst fears were being realized. One of the impacted landowners, Liz Van Leeuwen, soon became the leading voice of Willamette Valley farmers. She was the David to the state government's Goliath, leading an aggressive grassroots campaign to protect her neighbor's property. Over the coming months, hundreds of landowners joined the movement. As the Oregon Statesman wrote, "This is like throwing a match into a can of kerosene as far as certain farmer and legislator groups are concerned. While the Highway Commission legally is clear of a violation of legislative intent, farmers can be pardoned for believing they fought their fight through the established channels and won, only to find that government is able to achieve its aims through another channel. The Norwood Island site was the most controversial of all, largely because it was in Liz Van Leeuwen's backyard. By the end of the year, plans were cancelled for this park altogether. With a PR nightmare on their hands, Glenn Jackson and Dave Talbot assured the public that they would not pursue condemnation any further. But the damage was already done. In the span of just a few months, the Greenway had gone from a nationally celebrated program to one of the most reviled projects in the state. With the Greenway Act now showing some clear flaws, legislators got to work on drafting a new bill to overhaul the program. In the meantime, in May of 1973, Oregon passed another landmark law called Senate Bill 100. This set new regulations for land use planning across the state. The idea was that this careful planning would strike a better balance between urban sprawl and the protection of the environment. Governor McCall echoed the widespread fear of Oregonians at the time, saying, "There is a shameless threat in our environment and to the whole quality of our life, and that is the unfettered despoiling of our land. Coastal condomania, sagebrush subdivisions, and the ravenous rampage of suburbia here in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mock Oregon's status as the environmental model of this nation." The bill also established the Land Conservation and Development Commission, or LCDC, to strictly enforce these new policies. But land use planning on this scale was a fairly new and controversial concept. Many people felt that limiting commercial development would stifle the state's economy. But McCall strongly believed that this was a critical safeguard for the environment, and that losing a few economic opportunities was worth the long-term benefits. With Senate Bill 100 passed, legislators turned their attention back to the Greenway. Less than 2 months later, a new Willamette River Greenway Act was signed into law on July 21, 1973. This modified the 1967 Act in several ways. For one, agricultural land was now considered compatible with the program. This meant that farmers could keep farming, and there would no longer be any efforts to acquire their land. The 4 remaining state parks in development could still use condemnation as necessary. But any new state parks along the river would have to follow the same restrictions as the rest of the Greenway. Likewise, all decisions would now be reviewed and approved by the new LCDC. This would keep the Highway Commission in check and avoid any more rogue behavior. Liz Van Leeuwen was instrumental in shaping this new bill. In her mind, this less intensive version of the Greenway was worth pursuing, as long as farmers didn't lose their livelihood in the process. As she told the press, "We owe a real debt of gratitude to the legislators and others who worked so hard to get through a land use bill that recognizes that agriculture is the essential industry in the valley. The farmers, I am sure, recognize that the river is public property, and therefore a public recreational travel route. We need to respect the public desire that its banks stay green and beautiful." Meanwhile, Bob Straub had reached the end of his term as state treasurer, and had spent the last year and a half taking a break from public office. But with another election approaching in 1974, it wasn't long before he was back on the campaign trail. Oregon's term limits meant that Tom McCall would not be able to run for a 3rd consecutive term. After years of waiting, Straub finally had a clear shot at the governor's office. Running against him this time was Republican Senator Victor Atiyeh. While he had similar political experience to Straub, Atiyeh was less well known by voters. Oregon was historically a Republican state, and had continued this trend for the last 8 years under McCall. But with the strong environmental focus in recent years, the state's political landscape was shifting. As Charles Johnson writes, "In a sense, Bob Straub was running for the 3rd term of Tom McCall. By the fall, Bob even had Republican Governor Tom McCall's official endorsement against his party's nominee. Senator Atiyeh ran a civil campaign and tried to downplay his conservative differences with Straub, in tune with the tenor of the times. Of course, Straub had big plans to revise McCall's Greenway program, and felt strongly that the state should acquire the riverbanks through condemnation. While the last 2 years had shown just how controversial this idea was, he still believed it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good.
I felt that the fatal mistake that was made that has prevented us from creating the full dream, which is a continuous strip of recreational scenic beauty along the Willamette River, was not allowing the power of condemnation to be used. If we'd had the power of condemnation and been able to move in and really extend these long sweeps of corridors, well, forever it would have been a tremendous asset for the Willamette Valley.
When election night arrived, Straub's years of waiting had finally paid off. Voters selected him as their next governor, and by a significant margin. With his dream finally achieved, Straub was confident he could turn around the Greenway and make it the incredible park that Oregonians deserved. As soon as Bob Straub took office in January of 1975, he was on the warpath to overhaul the Greenway. After watching his dreams stagnate for the last 8 years, he was eager to move away from Tom McCall's soft approach. As Charles Johnson writes, "No political goal was more deeply personal to Straub than attempting to renew his vision of a continuous parkway along the Willamette River. Ignoring a parting warning from McCall that a more active approach would lead to an uprising in the farming community, Bob could not resist taking up one of his signature causes, which he considered unfinished business. With agricultural land completely off limits, Straub focused on the vast stretches of rural land that were not being farmed. He figured these could still be developed into vast recreational areas, even if they weren't the full length of the river. He began drafting his own Greenway bill that, if approved, would allow the state to condemn this land for recreational use. As he explained to the press, "Along the major portion of the river, there is a belt of trees, wild blackberry bushes, and other shrubbery. That's the portion I want to acquire and put into public ownership, as we've done with our beaches and our park system. We think we can put it together in such a way that in no circumstances will it conflict with agriculture. We've got to move ahead with a program that will do the job and serve the future needs of the people. I want to move on this project and not just lie down and die like we're doing." Despite Straub's assurances, farmers didn't trust him for a second. He had opposed their position for the last 8 years, and made it clear that he supported strong governmental control. By insisting on his own revised plan as soon as he took office, Straub threatened to undo years of careful collaboration between legislators and rural communities. His plan even got some pushback from his own peers. As the optimism of the 60s had faded, so did the enthusiasm for a giant park. Developing something of this scale would impact thousands of acres of untouched habitat. From a conservation standpoint, it now made more sense to simply leave these areas alone. Straub sent his bill to the legislature, but most lawmakers felt his changes were too controversial and ultimately unnecessary. The bill was soon trapped in the limbo of committee review and never resurfaced. Meanwhile, as the LCDC continued to enforce Oregon's land use policies, they began to manage the Greenway in a similar way. As it turned out, the Willamette's natural habitats could be preserved simply by restricting development along the river. With these new zoning regulations, the state wouldn't need to acquire any private land at all. This was considerably less exciting than a giant park, but Straub recognized that this was the most realistic path forward. He accepted defeat and commended the LCDC for their new approach to the program. As the Oregon Statesman wrote, "A river of ink and an acre of paper later, Onthank's ideas have been substantially modified. The concept of a publicly owned linear park has given way to that of a predominantly privately owned strip of land only partially protected from development." By 1977, Oregon Parks and Recreation started developing some of the scattered properties they had acquired over the last decade. Some of these would get basic amenities like picnic tables and toilets, while others would be left in their natural state. The department also put work into their 4 new state parks. Lone Tree Bar would see the most recreation in terms of trails, campgrounds, and road access, while the other 3 parks would be less developed. Meanwhile, the cities along the river were getting to work as well. Using the land they had acquired through the Greenway program, they began developing an array of urban waterfront parks. For example, the city of Salem established Minto Brown Island Park. This offered 800 acres of sprawling natural space just a short distance from the city center. In Portland, the city's oldest freeway was torn out along the river. A brand new waterfront park was developed in its place, revitalizing downtown with 36 acres of green space. As the 1978 election season approached, Governor Straub faced off against a familiar rival, Senator Vic Atiyeh. But while Straub's last victory had come fairly easily, this time there were bigger factors working against him. Oregon had suffered from economic recession in recent years, and Straub's support for high taxes and government regulation were not well received. Atiyeh came prepared with a stronger campaign, and his conservative cost-cutting policies were generally more appealing to voters. On November 7th, Senator Atiyeh was successful in winning the governorship. Straub would only ever serve this single term in office. While he was devastated by the loss, his good friend Tom McCall was sympathetic, writing, "You, Bob, would have been Oregon's greatest governor ever in your second term. Oregon is a better state because of everything you have given its people." In the end, Bob Straub would never get his chance to steer the Willamette Greenway, and it would never be the continuous park he had promised 12 years earlier. But in the pursuit of this dream, the river had seen a remarkable turnaround, and Oregonians had gained a newfound appreciation for their natural inheritance. So in that sense, perhaps the Greenway wasn't such a failure after all. More than 50 years after it was conceived, the Willamette Greenway still quietly lives on as an active program. Today, Oregon Parks and Recreation manages more than 80 properties along the river. Most of these scattered land plots are small and isolated, and only a handful have been developed for public use. One example of this is Parrot Mountain Access, nestled along the river between Newburgh and Wilsonville. The property itself is unremarkable, but it's one of the many living remnants of a long-forgotten dream. Likewise, many of the city and county parks along the river were created during the height of the Greenway program as well. It's humbling to think just how many of these would not exist today if they hadn't been part of a much grander vision. The 4 state parks along the river also survive to this day. Today they're known as Molalla River, Willamette Mission, Bowers Rock, and Elijah Bristow State Parks. These are still some of the largest areas for recreation along the river, and they continue to preserve large sections of the natural habitat. Before the Greenway Act was signed in 1967, only 5 miles of the riverbanks were publicly owned. By the time the program was slowing down in 1978, this had grown substantially to 65 miles. In the decades since, that number has slowly grown to about 120 miles. This has been no small feat, but to put it in perspective, even this is only a fraction of what would have been needed for the Greenway's original vision. While the river itself is in better condition than in decades past, pollution continues to be an ongoing issue. Keeping the river clean is not the political priority it once was. And in a way, it still faces many of the same challenges it did half a century ago. The nonprofit group Willamette Riverkeeper leads the charge on the river's upkeep and works to protect its natural habitats. In recent years, they've even acquired Norwood Island, helping to preserve some of the land that never became a state park. For some landowners in the valley, the name Willamette Greenway still dredges up hard feelings from decades past. And the question of whether a continuous park should have been built is still difficult to answer. Where do we draw the line between personal sacrifice and the greater good? What are the practical limits of conservation? We may never know for certain. But the story reminds us that we can always afford to show a little more compassion, not only to nature, but also to each other.